Let's read some news articles together, just a little bit closer than normal. The article sets itself up to be about possible issues families are facing, but it starts with this: a detailed backstory that makes the child with a disability out to be an unlikely character. This segment is from an article about a girl who is a disability advocate. The reporter states that just because she realized she was autistic, that automatically makes her a spokesperson for others with autism. The definition of malady is a disease or an ailment. Using disability and disease in the same context can immediately create labels. It is great that someone with such a platform is speaking about disability, but the article makes the son with a disability out to be a burden, and that it is so hard for Colin Farrell considering how strenuous his job is as an actor. This creates fear that disability is a death sentence. I can tell that this is for PR purposes, but it makes out people with disabilities to as just being in workspaces as decorations. Lastly, this article was promising, but every single voice in the article was from the people who started the organization, rather than the people who are actually in the organization and what it means to them. All of these stories were picked from news outlets that may not be mainstream, but people do read them every day. Most of these disability stories are catered to able-bodied people as a way to connect their lives with the people in the story.
When people ask you, how do you do this? What is your answer to that?
The same way anyone else does it. I still need to find a cast. I still need to find a crew.
Most able-bodied journalists have good intentions with their reporting, but what about the rarity of journalists with disabilities? Just because there's a misrepresentation within disability coverage, does that automatically make reporters with disabilities in charge of changing the narratives themselves? After some digging, I managed to find a professional organization for journalists with disabilities called the Disabled Journalists Association, but it is a fairly new organization that is not nearly as popular as, say, the investigative reporters and editors, or any of the organizations that support journalists who are a part of other marginalized communities. On a structural level, people with disabilities have a higher rate of unemployment, so that is why there is a rarity of journalists with disabilities to begin with. People with disabilities are not the other. They make up over 70 million people in the US, which is about 20% of the population. John Lepke is a freelance journalist and theater artist from Canada who is mostly known for his reporting on parasports, but he has also been featured in other outlets like CBC and Teen Vogue. He is pushing for more voices with disabilities and greater inclusion in reporting, but just because he seeks to have more disability representation in journalism, he does not consider himself an advocate because his job is to be a journalist.
Because I think disabled journalists quite often get, much like disabled sources, they get sort of pigeonholed into one. They can write about their trauma, or they can write about the one thing that they know. And sometimes you get to be the blast of refreshing air that says, okay, I'm sure you've been asked 14,000 times about your car accident. Can we talk about your nonprofit, please?
This is what some activism looks like. The League of the Physically Handicapped in New York City in 1935. It was the first recorded sit-in in U.S. history, but wasn't even considered the first sit-in until decades later by a historian with a disability. Later is the 1977 504 protest, where groups all over the country gathered to ensure Section 504 was signed as part of the Rehabilitation Act. This still is the longest recorded sit-in in U.S. history. Then there's a Capitol crawl in March of 1990, where activists came out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the steps of Capitol Hill to demand the passage of the Americans with Disability Act. And here is Stephanie Woodward in June of 2017, being forcibly pulled from her wheelchair after a sit-in in front of Mitch McConnell's office after proposed Medicaid cuts, which immediately would have affected the livelihood of people with disabilities. Without the historical activism, there would not be the built world we know today.
Because a lot of times we're so focused on let's not have the inspo porn narrative that we don't. It's hard to get past that. And in the same way that, like, if we're constantly arguing about whether somebody prefers person first language or identity first language, it's like having that argument while the ramp still isn't built or the interpreter isn't there. At some point, the discussions become a circle, and you have to, part of the advocacy work within the industry and outside of it is figuring out how to use the old adage, cut through the noise.
John dreams of a day where the news covers parasport scandals. There was a coach that slapped a player during a women's world championship wheelchair basketball tournament, but it barely got any coverage. Imagine if that happened in an NBA game. He hopes that the news will start being less afraid of talking about disability. It is obvious that, but having the same inspirational narratives in the news will not promote any kind of change or invoke rage amongst viewers to want said change.
But if you and I didn't know each other and you just happen to be interviewing me about like why I like the color blue or something, it wouldn't be immediately obvious unless you knew what you were looking for that I am disabled. If I flip this blur off and I pulled my wheelchair out from beneath my seat, behind my chair, like there is a different expectation there. We don't do a good job of talking about disability and how it intersects with different communities. And I think journalism has a place to create more nuance. And that in and of itself is like, comes across as very like tone policey, and I don't mean it that way. Like time and a place for yelling and all those things. People are allowed to have their opinions and their thoughts. We wouldn't have journalism otherwise. But I do think being able to show the nuance and being able to show the intricacies is part of how we create a more accessible society.